AJ, let's start with you. Donald Trump introduced the idea of stop and frisk this week. He says now he was only talking about Chicago. Here's what I'm curious about, the politics of this. I went back and looked in New York when this was a major issue a few years ago. 67% of black New Yorkers said they were opposed to this policy. So here's Donald Trump, who says he's out there reaching out to black voters. This is the policy he proposes. This is not going to help him with black voters, is it?
Well, I resent the implication that a law and order candidate and pushing law and order policies is somehow antithetical to the African-American community. On the contrary, they go hand in hand. When you look at a place like Chicago,
what I'm asking about, I'm not making that implication. I'm just giving you the poll numbers.
Good.
The policy was in place in New York. 2/3 of black voters were opposed to it. He says, I want the policy for Chicago now. I'm saying, won't that hurt him with black voters since we have polling evidence that it was very unpopular with black voters?
No, I think it was unpopular because they were fed misinformation from the media as far as to how stop and frisk actually worked in the community. And when you look at a place like Chicago or Ohio, where Mr. Trump was speaking, by the way, at an African-American outreach event, which we greatly applaud him for, when you look at a place like Chicago, where they basically stopped using stop and frisk, the numbers are the police department has decreased its usage by about 80%. I think the African-American community in Chicago, if you would ask them, are you perhaps in favor of looking at this policy, maybe coming up with a sensible approach around it, some reforms, but using it quite heavily once again? I think we might be surprised to see what they'd say. It's time to put an end to the violence there, Steve. And when you see children being shot in the streets, African-American children who should be safe, I'd be curious to see how African-Americans would feel about an actual policy proposal, not like Hillary Clinton's, but one like Donald Trump's that specifically might actually help the community.
Well, Nina Turner, let me ask you, stop and frisk here in New York, basically over a generation. You did see a big drop in New York and nationally, too, in violent crime in the 90s, the early 2000s. Stop and frisk was in place. Of course, critics of the program say, hey, it's been out of existence in the city in a major way in the last few years. The crime rates haven't spiked, but you look at what's going on in Chicago. Could there be some positive from implementing a program like that in terms of the crime rate?
Steve, not stop and frisk. And, you know, even Mayor de Blasio, when he talked about how crime has gone down in New York over the last 3 years, it was very clear that that was unconstitutional, and it was a racist policy. We know that disproportionately African Americans and Latino folks were stopped and frisked as if they are somehow more criminal than somebody else. And what I will say is that if a community speaks up, the African American community was polled, and it wasn't the skewing of the mainstream media, in that they do not like that policy. Now, Chicago does need some help. There's no doubt about it. There's no way for us to spin out of that the violence in that city and some of the violence that we see in cities all across this country need to be addressed, not when we're in crisis, but coming to the table together. But stop and frisk is not the type of policy that should be used to really bring about the peace and trust and accountability that we need in our communities across this country.
Well, meanwhile, today, Donald Trump's running mate, Mike Pence, said that this country should put an end to the debate about institutional bias or racism. Those are his words there within law enforcement after tragedies like this. Here's Pence.
Donald Trump and I believe that there's been far too much of this talk of institutional bias or racism within law enforcement. Police officers are human beings, and in difficult and life-threatening situations, mistakes are made.
AJ, let me ask you about that. When you look at, we just put the stats up there, the stop and frisk program, how that disproportionately affected African Americans. We look at these officer-involved shootings, again, how they disproportionately, just when you look at the statistics, affect African Americans. Isn't race some component of this?
Yeah, always there is. But listen, at the end of the day, when you have a policy like stop and frisk, whether it was disproportionately affecting certain communities or certain people look at it that way, let's take a look at the actual stats. You had hundreds, in just 1 year alone in 2014 in New York, I think it was 400 guns were taken off the streets because of stop and frisk. So whether we can get into a debate as to whether it disproportionately impacts racial communities or not, the fact is it does remove crime. And yes, Pence has a point, but Donald Trump, let's keep in mind, also said that Tulsa, the officer there, did behave inappropriately. He criticized her. And I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think Pence is absolutely correct that we need to stop this talk of institutional racism in our police departments.
Oh my
Many
God.
of these brave officers, like the one in Charlotte, are African American themselves.
Nina Turner.
Steve, listen. Institutional racism exists in this country. African-American community is not delusional about this. What is happening in Charlotte is not just about Charlotte. It's about Tulsa. It's about Cleveland. It's about Baltimore. It's about Ferguson. It is about the fact that racism exists in the DNA of America, and the only way that we're going to deal with it is to confess our sins. It didn't start with police, and it doesn't end with police. It is the entire system. And as an African-American mother of an African-American son who is a law enforcement officer, who has been racially profiled throughout his life, who does wear a badge and a gun, who I do worry about on both ends, let me just tell you this. We have to deal with these issues in a very real way, and the African-American community is sick and tired of the same sad song being played over and over and over and over again. And just like novelist James Baldwin and activist James Baldwin said, he said to be black in America and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage all the time. And when we have leaders who don't even want to acknowledge that we have institutional racism in this country, political, economic, financial, we have to admit that, and we have to do something about it. And all communities need the police, but we need transparency, we need accountability, we need trust, and they are not mutually exclusive, but it is okay for the African-American community to call foul, and that is what we are doing all across this country. And we sick and tired of the same old song being played over and over again, yet in the wake of all of this, there are dead black men and dead black women in this country. They hold up their hands, they die. They on the ground, they die. We got to stop it, and stop it right now. And I'm going to tell you another thing, Steve. We ain't got to wait for presidential candidates. We need governors and mayors, people in city councils and state legislators right now to use the power of public policy to change this right now.
All right.
And that's
Nina
why
Turner
Donald Trump
and
was in
AJ
Toledo.
Delgado, I got to leave it there. Thank you for the time, though. We appreciate it.